How much do you have to invest into JEPI to be able to live off of the dividend payments? And the answer is actually quite a bit less than I originally thought it would be. JEPI, also known as JEPI, is a covered call ETF that currently has a massive dividend yield of around 12%, and it pays out dividends every single month. JEPI is an actively managed fund, which means their expense ratio is a little bit higher than some passively managed funds, such as VOO. JEPI seeks to generate income by investing in US stocks, which have low volatility and which appear undervalued, and provides massive dividend payments through investments in equity-linked notes, which are very similar to covered call options. Almost all of the income that JEPI generates and pays out each month is based on the option premium it receives on these equity-linked notes. It's important to note that the income generated from options premium is heavily dependent on market volatility. The more volatile the markets are, the more options premium JEPI can receive and then pay out to its shareholders as dividends. The fund is relatively new and has only been around since 2020, and since then it has underperformed the S&P 500, but if we look at 2022, we can see the fund actually performed the S&P 500 during the bear market. If you'd like to see a more in-depth breakdown on JEPI, you can watch this video I recently released breaking down the fund at the link in the description. But with the fund skyrocketing in popularity, we need to answer the question of how much do we need to invest into JEPI to be able to live off of the dividend payments. So let's go ahead and jump into my spreadsheet designed for the sole purpose of seeing how much we need to be able to live off of dividend incomes. And the first thing we need to do is to jump over to our cost of living tab. And you can see for this scenario, we're going to assume we need $4,000 a month to be able to live off of dividend income. And we're also assuming inflation is going to average 2% a year. So at the beginning of a 30-year period, again, we need $4,000. At the end of our 30-year period, due to the fact that inflation compounds just like investing, we're going to need a little over $7,200 to be able to live off of dividend income. Now, typically when people see how much they need to live off of dividends, they perform the calculation incorrectly. So let's go ahead and show a quick example of what that would look like. If we need $4,000 a month over a 12-month period, that would mean we need $48,000 a year. Now, with JEPI currently trading at $53.40, they have a current starting dividend yield of around 12%, but based on historical market option volatility, JP Morgan says that JEPI should typically deliver yields of around 5 to 8%. So let's say for this scenario, JEPI's dividend yield will average around 7.5%. With a quick formula, we can quickly see how much we would need to be able to live off of dividend income. And in this scenario, if we were to invest a lump sum, we would need $640,000. But fortunately, if you invest over longer periods of times, the amount you need will be much, much less. Let's go ahead and jump into my back test, and I'll go ahead and zoom out. And again, we're going to be projecting over a 30-year period how JEPI will perform to see how much we need to live off of dividend income. So let's go ahead and jump into our variables. Now, to plug in variables, we want to look at historical data and what analyst expectations for this fund is. So let's go ahead and jump over to Seeking Alpha so we can look at some data on this fund. Now, keep in mind, this is still a fairly young fund. We don't have a whole lot of historical data, which does make it a little bit more difficult to plug in some variables. But the variables we need to plug in is going to be our price growth rate assumption. We're going to need to make a dividend growth rate assumption and a starting dividend yield assumption. So for dividend growth, let's go ahead and jump over to dividends, look at this dividend history, and we can see the payouts for JEPI actually fluctuate quite a bit because remember, it's based on the volatility of the options market. So they've had dividend payouts monthly as low as 26 cents, but they've also had dividend payouts as high as 62 cents. Now, on a year-to-year basis, if we jump over to dividend growth, we can see their dividends have been increasing, but it's definitely not guaranteed that that will continue to be the case. So based off what we've been told by the fund managers, we can expect to see a price growth rate of around 1%, a dividend growth rate of around 1%, and a starting dividend yield of around 7.5%. And for this scenario, we're going to be assuming that I contribute $1,000 every single month. And again, we're projecting this over a 30-year period. So let's go ahead and jump over and look at our results now. Again, you can see our black line is our cost of living and the purple line is JEPI. So eventually we will be able to live off of dividend income around the year 2048. But more importantly, we want to answer of how much do we need to invest over that time period. So let's go ahead and jump over here and I'll start scrolling down and you can see it still says no, we can't live off of dividend incomes until we get to around 25 and a half years of investing. You can see at that point we would be able to live off of dividend income because our monthly dividends are then higher than our monthly cost of living, and the total amount we would have contributed over that time period is about $305,000. The total amount of dividends we would have received over that time period is just a little under $680,000, and our account value would be $1.075 million. Now, it's important to remember in the case of JEPI, since we have so little historical data, the variables could be different over longer periods of time. So for example, I think it's very impossible that we don't see any dividend growth at all, but we also could see a higher average yield over time. So let's say we have an average yield of 8.5%, but a 0% dividend growth rate. If we jump back over, if we scroll down, we can see it would be a little over 28 years until we could live off of dividend income, and our total contribution would be around $340,000, with total dividends being around $864,000, and our account value at $1.33 million. And keep in mind, all of this scenario is based on the fact that we will be reinvesting our dividends over that same time period. And if we jump over and look at our contributions versus gains chart, you can see the blue is going to be our total contribution and the orange is going to be our total gains over that time period. So this chart here, we're looking at the first 10 years. So even after 10 years, our total contributions will be more than the total gains that we've received. But over a 30-year time period, our total gains definitely start to outnumber our total contributions, with our account value ending at around 1.5 million and 1.17 coming from total gains. Now, unfortunately, all of these results are very dependent on what your tax scenario are, and taxes can vary greatly depending on what country or what state you live in, what your personal income is, and whether or not you are utilizing a tax-deferred retirement account. 80 to 85 of JEPI's dividends are taxed as ordinary income, which means as much as 50% of the yield could go to the IRS if you owned it in a taxable account where the investor is in the highest tax bracket. So if you are a US-based investor, I highly suggest you utilize JEPI in a tax-deferred retirement account. Otherwise, a lot of the dividends you receive will be taxed at a potentially fairly high rate. So while you may be happy with the results you saw from JEPI, I'm here to tell you there's actually a lot better options for long term if you're seeing how little you can invest to live off of dividend incomes. So let's go ahead and look at a dividend growth example. Let's assume that we're looking at a price growth rate of 8%, a dividend growth rate of 10%, and a starting dividend payout much lower than JEPI, only around 3%. If we go ahead and look at this example, we'll come over here and start scrolling down, and you can see at 10 years we can't, at 15 we can't, at 20 we can't, but in year 23, we would be able to live off of the dividend payments. We would have only contributed around $285,000, but at that point, our monthly dividends would start to be greater than our monthly cost of living. Something else that you do need to understand in this dividend growth example is that our dividend growth rate is much higher than the growth rate of inflation that we're going to be seeing every year. So what does this mean? Well, basically, if we quit reinvesting our dividends because we were living off of those dividend payments, the monthly income we receive from dividends will continue to grow faster than the rate of inflation, meaning we can continue to grow our wealth over time, even if we're living off of dividends. And unfortunately, the same is probably not true for JEPI. If JEPI has a dividend growth rate of 0% and our monthly cost of living continues to increase at 2% a year, if we're living off of the dividends from JEPI, that means that eventually our monthly cost of living will surpass our dividend payments that we're receiving every single month due to the fact we're no longer reinvesting those large dividend payments. JEPI also sacrifices a considerable amount of long-term return potential compared to the S&P 500 in exchange for implementing an option strategy that boosts income and minimizes volatility. So for example, let's go ahead and jump over to our analysis, and we can see at the end of our 30-year period, your portfolio value with JEPI would be a little over $1.5 million. But if we look at our dividend growth example and scroll to the end of our 30-year period, we can see our portfolio value would be over $3.8 million. While JEPI's strategy is beneficial during a market downturn as it mitigates losses over the long haul, the stock market does typically trend upward. By utilizing this approach, you forfeit a substantial amount of potential long-term gains, as we can see from the data. So there you go, that's how much you need to invest into JEPI to be able to live off of the dividend payments. The fund provides large monthly dividends, but can have serious tax implications and can minimize your long-term returns. If you do invest into the fund, I'd highly suggest making it a smaller portion of your portfolio and consider better long-term options such as dividend growth ETFs or dividend growth companies. JEPI does make up a very small of my personal dividend portfolio, but for the most part, I'm much more focused on investing into quality dividend growth companies. So if you'd like to be able to download this spreadsheet, you can head over to my Patreon page at the link in the description. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.